Good to be with you. Good to be with you. James chapter 1. James chapter 1. Always good to be with our brethren, and what a joy and a privilege that is. The relationship we share. Some, for me, going back a number of years here at Campbell Road, and some others that are here as well from other places. But just a wonderful opportunity to get together and to look into the Word of God, especially from the perspective of a men's weekend. And so I'm certainly been prayerful about this weekend, and hope that as we conclude tomorrow afternoon, that all of us will be, as Jordan said, the better for our time here this evening and tomorrow. There are two major themes that are found throughout all of the 66 books of the Bible. One of them is the way to God, and it's a theme that is addressed to the alien sinner, to the one who is spiritually dead. And through that information, God gives to that person word in terms of how they can come to know Him. But the greater portion of the Bible really deals with the second, and that is our walk with God. It's written to the Christian, to the child of God. And it's instruction that tells us how to serve Him, how to please Him, the God that we have come to know. And certainly the better part of the New Testament contains this kind of information, and that would include really the entire book of James. James will deal with this in a way unlike any other book in the New Testament. Its 5 chapters are rich with life-changing truth that is so very practical that some have referred to the book of James as the Proverbs of the New Testament. It teaches us how to walk wisely in this world as a follower of Jesus Christ. Now, if you're familiar with James, admittedly you know that, look, this is not some deep doctrinal treatise like the book of Romans. In fact, Martin Luther didn't have much use for James. He referred to it as an epistle of straw. What does he know? James, obviously, he's not writing to reaffirm some great doctrine or to establish some marvelous teaching of faith. He's writing to encourage faith's practice. He's telling us how we can live as people who genuinely walk with Jesus. His style of writing is very direct. It's very down to earth, where the Apostle Paul, he'll have 15 verses that'll be a single sentence. James is very brief. James is much more to the point, where Paul oftentimes will explore an issue. He'll look almost to cover every single base. James kind of, hits his target, and then he quickly moves on to his next subject. And it provides this, it sort of feels disjointed to us, but doesn't, it doesn't flow, like some other books. But James he moves from one target quickly to the next as he deals with us in giving us instruction on how we can better walk with God. In fact, there's over 50 imperatives in the book of James. And in his writing, he reminds us that intellectual, that verbal expressions of faith are useless if there is not a demonstration of a transformed life. And I think Ben's going to talk about that in chapter 2. Over and over again, James is going to ask the question, if you say you believe like you should, then why do you behave like you shouldn't? And what I find really intriguing is the fact that if James is in fact the first book to be written of the New Testament, many believe that it is, I find it intriguing that the Holy Spirit chose this book to be the very first one, that for Christians to examine their need, or examine themselves to make sure that they are behaving in ways that are in keeping with what they say they believe. That even though they have been saved, even though they have this new identity in Christ, it doesn't eliminate the difficulties and the challenges of living as a Christian. It doesn't provide them with some automatic victory. It doesn't put them forever beyond the influence of the world or the allurements of Satan. His introduction is incredibly brief, and yet it conveys some powerful truths. In fact, we could probably just camp out here in chapter 1 or verse 1. James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad. Greetings. I'm James. Who is this? What James is this? Well, I know, I'm not going to pin you down. I know there's not 100% certain. Who is this? It's a half-brother of Jesus. Think of how this guy could have introduced himself. Hey, I'm the half-brother of the creator of the universe. He doesn't do that. He just says, hi, I'm James. He's clearly well known. He doesn't need any kind of further explanation. He identifies himself as a doulos, a bondservant. William Barclay says that it's someone who is characterized by absolute obedience, absolute humility, and absolute loyalty. And he sees himself as a servant of two masters. How can you do that? I thought Jesus said you can't serve two masters. You can if they are co-equal, and God and Jesus are. Okay? The recipients of the letter, 12 tribes who are dispersed. 12 tribes, where does your mind go to when you think of that? Goes to Old Testament Israel, right? The sons of Jacob. He may be writing predominantly to Jewish Christians, but he may be writing to New Israel. And therefore, his audience would include both Jews and Gentiles. Certainly by the time he writes, the Gentiles have come into the church. And of course, the second element, that they are dispersed. After the exile in Babylon, Israel was divided into two groups. There were those who returned to the promised land and lived in Israel, and then there was the diaspora, those who chose to remain among the nations. And so he may be writing to Jewish Christians who are apart or separated or outside of Judea, but he may be writing to the new Israel, Jews and Gentiles who belong to Christ, who are part of the new Israel, and who, as citizens of heaven, yet living in this world, are dispersed in a place where it's not their home. All right, he then, where most New Testament writers have this somewhat lengthy, Paul's the wordiest in the book of Romans, but a lengthy greeting where he expresses gratitude for his readers, where he offers the blessing to God for his rich provision. James, he just steps onto the edge and he jumps into the deep end. And he starts with trials. Verse 2. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. It's a pretty natural starting point, isn't it? Because as a Christian, we're going to have challenges and difficulties, and in reality, everyone is going to encounter them. Have you ever noticed that it doesn't matter how well you try and insulate your world, there's going to be someone or something who's always going to try and mess it up, and they usually succeed, don't they? If Jesus couldn't avoid trouble in his life, then there's not much chance that you and I will either. In essence, James says, look, if your Christianity is real, then it has to show up in times of trial. If your faith is no good for trouble, then it's no good. If your faith is only good when you don't really need it, you don't really need it. If faith is only good when things are going well, what use is that? And you'll notice that he begins by conveying a very important truth, and that is that challenges and trials in life are not a matter of if, they're a matter of when. He doesn't say if you encounter various trials. No, he says when you do. They are inevitable, and so don't be surprised when you encounter them. He describes them as various, variegated, many-colored is the idea of the word. We actually get our word polka dot from this. There's a little bit of trivia for you if you ever come across that question. He's not saying we will have a lot of trials. That may or may not be true. What he's saying is that we'll face all kinds of them. The trials will come in all different shapes and colors and sizes. They'll range from fear to conflict to loneliness to disappointment to misunderstanding, persecution, sickness, death. They will come from a wide array of people. They will come from neighbors and coworkers, from strangers and friends, even from brethren and family. And sometimes, if we're honest with ourselves, some of our trials are self-inflicted, aren't they? The word encounter is also interesting. It is suggesting an unforeseen, an unwelcome experience. It's actually the same word that's used in the parable of the Good Samaritan when Jesus says that the certain man fell into the hands of the robbers in Luke chapter 10 and verse 30. So James is saying, look, he's not talking about people go looking for trials. He's saying trials are going to come find you. You don't need to go look for them. The word trial is an interesting word as well. It translates a word that's basic idea is trouble, something that breaks the pattern of tranquility or peace, joy and happiness, but it also contains the concept of testing. Now, go from verse 2 down to verse 12, because I want you to notice that here we find not only an inclusion but an allusion. Okay, so verse 12, blessed is a man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Okay, so we have inclusion. He's talking about trials in verse 2. He's going to pause on that a little bit, it seems, and then he's going to come back to it in verse 12. So we see this bracketing in terms of trials. And when you hear the phrase, blessed is a man, what do you think of? Sermon on the Mount. And there's going to be a lot of allusions and references to the Sermon on the Mount in James, in the book of James. Okay? James declares blessing on the one who perseveres through trial and who passes the test. Blessing doesn't come because we happen to be able to live a life that's free from trial. James says blessing comes when we are victorious coming through them. And so he's not describing the happiness of someone who doesn't know conflict, but the one who's experienced conflict and who has fought and who has won. Not a spectator, but a participant. The word persevere here references not a passive endurance, not mere survival. James is not instructing here sort of a, hey, suck it up, buddy, and get over it, or a, grit your teeth and get through it kind of endurance. This is a triumphant, active endurance. And he says that's the person who's blessed. That's the person who receives the crown. And notice the foundation of all of this. Our perseverance is based on love. Our love for God becomes the key. In any relationship, those who love, truly love, are not the ones who bail out at the first sign of difficulty. The ones who love are the ones who hold fast, right? And we could stop and apply that to a lot of different areas in life. And so Christianity is not just some transaction where God saves us, regardless of our attitude or approach. It's not something where we just believe in a body of truth. It's a relationship of ongoing love. And James says that it is in the midst of difficulty that our love for God becomes most vividly, among other things, most vividly revealed. Many of us have witnessed just the opposite of that, haven't we? You've been in the church any length of time at all, you've seen people who encounter some sort of a trial, some sort of a difficulty, and it revealed their faith to be less than what you thought it was. Whether it was some financial issue, some disappointment with family or with brethren, the storm of sorrow, and they made a decision to walk away from God and from God's people. Now, how do we triumph over trial? How do we gain the victory over that? Because James provides us with 5 pieces of information here in this text. And you'll notice that it begins with the right attitude. What's the attitude we're supposed to have? Joy. Joy. By the way, he references brethren there. Consider all joy, my brethren. That's one of the favorite terms of James. He'll use that over and over again. It's like, look, guys, we are in this together. Every word in that phrase, consider it all joy. Every word in that's significant. Consider. It's a being precise, definitive, decisive about something. It's describing a settled conviction. It's the same word Paul uses in Philippians 3 and verses 7 and 8 when he says, count it all joy. That small two-letter word, it, that encompasses all of life, including the hidden reefs, the sudden storms, the fierce opponents, the challenging circumstance. All of that is in that little word, it. As some people say, if is the biggest word in life. You seen that? Have you ever seen that before? If we're going to employ wisdom in the realm of trials, James says it has to begin with an attitude of joy. The word all, by the way, speaks of intensity, a genuine joy. If we're going to be equipped to persevere, if we're hoping to come out on the other side victorious, we're going to have to approach trials not with anger, not with frustration, not with disappointment, not with dread, but with joy. And that seems utterly absurd, doesn't it? To quote Charles Emerson Winchester, that is absurd. And yet, if we're facing trials with wisdom, James says you'll see them as a welcome friend and not a dreaded enemy. He's going to talk about here in just a moment why we can see them that way. But really, this is, in fact, the attitude of Jesus. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2. The author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. This is not a, man, I sure am glad I get to go through this kind of joy. It's a joy that's based on something else. But as is the case with almost all biblical teaching, if not all of it, it starts in the heart and it starts in the mind. And so if we're going to flesh out the will of God in regard to trials, it demands a radical, dramatic approach in terms of our attitude. How are we going to do that? What's the first word of verse 3? If you're reading out of the version Paul carried, New American Standard. Knowing, okay? I am kidding about that too, by the way, but only a little. Knowing. How can I have an attitude of joy in the midst of trial? It's because of what I know. What I know. I know some things, and by the way, the word knowing here, knowing by experience, knowing that the testing of your faith produces something. What James is going to point to is that a proper approach to trials, that this attitude of joy is based on an understanding of where it's taking us. James says, look, don't make the mistake of thinking that difficulties that you encounter in life are meaningless, that they have no purpose. They can accomplish something good. They can and they do accomplish something good. They produce endurance. The word here is hupomone. He's not describing one single act of determination. It's a word that describes a remaining under something. It describes someone who's carrying a heavy load for an extended period of time. This is an active, persistent steadfastness, staying power, stickability. It's like a muscle that becomes stronger with resistance. How many of us who are older ever thought, you're going to go to a gym, you're going to see big rubber bands to work out with? But it's about resistance, isn't it? Resistance builds muscle. And so the child of God learns greater faithfulness over time as we encounter various challenges and difficulties. But James doesn't just have in mind steadfastness. That's just a means to an end. Endurance is looking to take us somewhere. Endurance is not the goal, okay? It's simply a way to achieve our goal, and that leads to his third point in verse 4, and that is that we are to focus on the end result. Let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Do you see the progression here? Consider attitude, knowing what we understand, and let. When you let it, what are we talking about here? Is it something we're active in, or is it something that we are allowing? Or we are kind of active because it's actually an imperative here, okay? But we're to allow it to have its perfect result in us. The trials that test our faith are not intended by God to hurt us. They're intended to help us. And the goal of endurance is spiritual maturity. The word perfect, when we typically think of that, we think of sinlessness, but that's not the word here. It was a word that was used to describe a fully mature animal or a fully ripened piece of fruit. What I find also interesting is that nobody in the New Testament uses this word more than James does. He wants us to be mature. He wants us to be ripe. Be careful how you think about that, okay? Several years ago, I grew up I was born in Pennsylvania. You can't help where you're born. I know you Southerners, look down on us Yankees. Born in Pennsylvania, but I grew up, one of the sections where I spent a lot of time in my young years was up in northwestern Pennsylvania in a town called Northeast. Okay? The explanation of that is, that little notch up there at the top? Northeast is in the northeastern corner of the notch that's in the northwest. Okay? But that area along Lake Erie, the climate, the soil, the conditions are perfect to grow Concord grapes. And probably your grape juice that most of us partake of on a Sunday probably comes from grapes from that region of our country. Welch's used to be based up there until they got bought out. And so we took this trip up there, and we went through where I used to live, and I'm showing Bev the grapes, and she's looking at the vineyard, and she's like, well, I don't see any grapes. We were there in July. So we stopped, we get out of the car, we walk up, and it's loaded. But they're all green. They're all green. But even though they're green, it'll never be more of a grape than what it is right then. Because what it lacks is not identity. What it lacks is maturity. And as it grows and as it matures, it becomes perfect. It becomes what God intended for it to be. Okay? The word complete is a word that means sound in every part. We get our word hologram from that. Three-dimensional picture using beams of laser light. And James says, look, when you are perfect and when you are complete, you lack nothing. Trials don't have the power to destroy our faith. They have the power to test it, though. They humble us. They reveal who and what we really love. They teach us the value of divine blessing. They equip us to help other people. They provide greater strength. And so James's counsel to us is allow trials to do what God intended them to do. Understand that these are the avenue that God has chosen by which we gain spiritual strength and maturity. But it's hard to have the right attitude when you're going through tough times, isn't it? Especially if they're extended tough times. You want to function based on what you know. You keep telling yourself these things. You want to allow them to have greater maturity, but there are times where you feel like you're being pulled under, where the trial is winning and you need some help. You're struggling to hold on. You need something that's solid to hang on to in the midst of the storm. And so notice where James points us in verse 5. He says, you turn to God and you ask him something, okay? Verse 5, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. James says, in the midst of trial, you've got to express a trusting heart. What we need in that circumstance is not human understanding. It's divine wisdom. How can I live my life in this situation that's ultimately going to bring glory to him? How can I have a clear view of this situation, to see it from his vantage point, to see it as an opportunity for him to achieve his purpose in my life? And you'll notice, by the way, that he uses that word lax, and so we have this literary connection between verse 4 and verse 5. And remember context. We saw the inclusion here, so whatever James is saying here is in the context of trials. The trials not only result in stronger and mature faith, but he says they enhance our prayer life. It brings us to our knees. We call upon God for the one thing that we desperately need and yet we don't have. The wisdom that enables joy and understanding and submission in the midst of trials. If somebody points at another person and says, that person sure knows their Bible, they're identifying them as a knowledgeable person, but not necessarily a wise person, right? Because a wise person not only knows the Bible, but they know how to use the Bible to understand life, to comprehend the world around them, to guide their behavior through a myriad of problems and difficulties. The wise person is able to see the truth about trials that are mentioned in verses 2 through 4, and then make the personal decision to chart a proper course and to facilitate progress towards spiritual maturity. That phrase, let him ask, in verse 5 is also an imperative. It's as much a command as Paul's pray without ceasing in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 17. And James says, look, if trials should drive us anywhere, it shouldn't be to despair, it shouldn't be to discouragement, it instead should be to God himself. And I love James's simplicity and his directness. James says, if you need wisdom, what do you need to do? What? Surely it can't be that simple, can it? If you need wisdom, James says, ask. Ask of it from God. And God will, well, maybe. That's not what James says. James says, he will give it to you. Here's another echo of the Sermon on the Mount, right? Ask and you'll receive. Knock and it'll be open. Seek and you'll find. When we come to God in search of wisdom, James says what we find is a generous giver. And the way this is written here, in essence, he's saying he's a giving God in the original. That's James's conviction of God's nature. That God not only possesses an abundance of wisdom, but he genuinely wants to share it with those who are seeking it. He delights in providing it to those who are willing to accept it. He says, guys, wisdom is there for the asking. And when we come to God, he's never going to say, hey, could you come back tomorrow? He's never going to say, I'm kind of busy right now, but as soon as I get to it, I'll provide you some. And obviously, there's a lot more to God's nature than just giving, but it's always giving. It's always giving. He then adds that it is without reproach. I like the NIV here. Without finding fault. To hold back nothing is the idea of the word. In other words, James says, look, if you ask God for wisdom, he doesn't dispense it to you with a thimble. He gives it to you in a dump truck load. And he also doesn't hold our previous record against us. It's without reproach. He doesn't say, are you here again? I gave you some last week and you blew it. You didn't use it. Why should I give you some more? Or you already have plenty. Why are you here asking for it? James says, look, the problem is not that God refuses or hesitates to give. It's that we fail to ask and fail to use it. Now, there is a condition that he attaches here, verse 6. But he must ask in faith without any doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. For that man ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. In essence, James says, look, if you're going to come and ask him, don't come with a divided heart. Don't come with a heart and an attitude that's waffling back and forth in terms of whether God has the desire or the ability to provide it. In other words, we need to trust. We need to have made up our mind. Look, God can provide to me what I need. Now, I don't think James is saying here that prayers will never be answered if there's any hint of doubt attached to them. I don't think that's what he's saying here. Doubt is kind of human, isn't it? His point, however, is that God doesn't respond to somebody whose insincere words don't match their heart. He provides, and he provides a picture of this. Not waves crashing on the beach, but the swells of the ocean, of the sea, that rise and fall. They never have the same shape. It's in this constant state of fluctuation and movement from one moment to the next, all depending on the direction of the wind. That's the doubter that James is talking about. He fails to pray to God with a constant allegiance. He wants to have one foot in both camps. He wants the wisdom from God one moment, and he wants the wisdom of the world the next moment. And I don't think this is some occasional lapse. This is a continual pattern that James is describing here. And he says, look, that guy's not going to get anything from the Lord because he is double-souled, is the literal Greek here. And he's unstable in all his ways. The reason he's not going to receive from God is because his life is one of constant vacillation. James is making the point here, look, our faith doesn't have to be perfect, but it does have to be real. And that's really what the book of James is all about. If life is getting out of hand, if our ability to cope with its challenges is diminishing, James says, ask. Ask a God who is committed to giving it to you, a generous God. Prove your allegiance to him. Go to him in prayer and ask for wisdom so that you may maintain a steady course through whatever storm you happen to be facing. Verse 9 through 11, and I am going to hit this very quickly because Ricky said, you can go anything less than 45 minutes, don't go more than 45 minutes. So, adopt a humble spirit. We'll just read the verses here. But the brother of humble circumstances is to glory in his high position, and the rich man is to glory in his humiliation, because like flowering grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with a scorching wind and withers the grass, and its flower falls off, and the beauty of his appearance is destroyed. So too the rich man in the midst of his pursuits will fade away. I think he's just saying, look, trials, everybody's equal in trials. Everybody is on level playing field. If you got money, you can't buy your way out of trouble. If you lose a kid, if you lose a mate, it doesn't matter how much money you have. You can't buy that sorrow away, okay? And so the poor man, the wise man, when it comes to trials, are on equal footing. James says, rejoice in that. James continues, he keeps it real. So he began with trials. All of us are affected by that. Notice where he goes in verse 13. Another case of not if, but when, and that's temptation. And there's not a one of us in this room that's not wrestled with temptation. It's the common experience, just like trials. It's the common experience of every human being. But what is also a common response of human beings is not to accept the responsibility, our responsibility for them. Now, as he shifts gears in verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted. It seems like he's making this huge disconnect between his first topic and his second. But it's actually a form of the same word that's been translated trials earlier in the chapter. So it's not that big of a dramatic change. But he does move from talking about difficulties that are intended to strengthen us to temptations that have the goal of trying to ruin us. Mark Antony was described as the silver-throated orator of Rome. And he was able to sway millions with the power of his tongue. He was a strong man on the outside, a man had the determination of steel. But on the inside, he was a moral weak man. And the story is told of one tutor who became so frustrated with his behavior that he shouted at him. He said, "O Marcus, colossal child, able to conquer the world, but unable to resist a temptation." What's true of Mark Antony is true of a lot of people in the world, and sometimes including us, right? That we take a trial in the form of poverty, and we turn it into a temptation because we're tempted to steal in order to deal with our trial. And so we have this same root playing back and forth. In that case, we've allowed something that was intended to provide greater maturity to us, and instead we've turned it into a source of evil. And so every difficulty that we encounter in life either strengthens us because we're seeking to walk by faith, we're leaning on him, we're depending upon him, we're going to him for wisdom in order to navigate our way through, or it's going to tempt me to deny God. to doubt his goodness, to disobey his instruction, to fall into sin. And when I choose that latter path, where's the fault lie? Does it lie with God? Because he's the one who allowed me to go through that trial. Does the blame fall on the trial itself? Or does the fault lie with me? Because we all understand that blaming somebody else for our sin is as old as sin itself, right? When James talks about trials and temptations, he's not dabbling in the realm of theory. This is real life. This is life in this world. This is where the rubber meets the road. And so James says in verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted. The idea of the word, when he is being tempted. In other words, in the heat of that moment, in the process of that temptation, don't let anybody think you can sort of let yourself off the hook because you're going to point the finger of blame at God. He's the one who's doing it. And that little word by in verse 13, that I am being tempted by God, that is the little preposition apo. Apo. It involves the idea of distance, from the outside, away from. In other words, it's a by, but it's indirect agency. He's not accusing God of directly tempting him. He's accusing God of indirectly tempting him. And who does that remind you of? Where did Adam go? What did Adam say? You didn't eat the fruit, did you, Adam? What? She made me do it, but it's more than that, isn't it? Who does he ultimately blame? The woman you gave me. Not my fault. I fell asleep and I woke up married. I didn't have anything to do with that. That girl never had a ring on her hand. You got to know the Hebrew to get all that out of there. But they're indirectly blaming God. And he doesn't do any better, right? What does she point to? The creature God made, the serpent, he deceived me, okay? James isn't going to have any of that nonsense. And so he provides us with 3 steps that we can be victorious over temptation. The first one is to trust the nature of God. Verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. Hard to misunderstand that, right? There's not a lot of different interpretations here. The pagan gods were susceptible to temptation because they were the creations of sinful men. They had the same wickedness, the same disposition, the same character as their human inventors. They were corrupt because their makers were corrupt. James says, look, God, on the other hand, cannot be tempted. It translates a single word found only here in the New Testament. God is untemptable, is what James is saying. He's inexperienced with evil. He has no capacity for wrongdoing, no vulnerability to sin. Evil doesn't appeal to him. It never penetrates his person because evil is the exact opposite of his nature. As the prophet Habakkuk said in chapter 1, verse 13, your eyes are too pure to approve evil, and you cannot look on wickedness with favor. Yes, he may allow a trial to occur. He may allow a temptation to occur. But James adds that he is never actively the one who's involved in that. In fact, he's always wanting and desiring our good, isn't he? He's never involved in our fall. He is involved in our stand. 1 Corinthians 10 in verse 13. Wish we had time to delve into that a little bit more. Second, look at verse 14. He says, accept the reality of man. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. You notice the conjunction there? But. Temptation never comes from God, James says. But it does come from you. In fact, here in James, we have a more clearly defined process of temptation and how it works than you'll find anywhere in Scripture. And I love the words he uses here. This is stuff that preachers just geek out on. Okay? This is one of the benefits of having at least some insight into original language. I tell people I know a little Greek. He sells baklava over here in Arlington, okay? The people at Northwest are so weary of that joke. I just get to where I just go ... and they fill in the blank, okay? James says temptation happens when we are carried away. Some versions use the word lured, and that's the word. It was a hunting term, and it was used to describe luring an animal into a snare or a trap. Enticed is a fishing term. It described baiting a hook in order to draw the fish. And what I want you to notice about both of those words is they don't employ coercion, they employ persuasion, okay? And so if you're trapping animals or you're catching fish, the bait you use has to be appealing and attractive so as to invite the creature that you're looking to capture to take the bait. Nobody goes out there fishing and puts a $5 bill on the hook, okay? When you go to lure, you want to catch an animal in a trap. You don't use diamond rings. You put the things that are in front of them that you think will draw them. And what an honest, straightforward picture of temptation. James says, look, the problem's not God. Don't blame him. And in reality, the problem's not Satan either. James says, look, we've seen the enemy, and the enemy's us. James says, we are carried away, we are enticed by our own lust, is how the New American Standard translates it. It's the word desire. It's a word that's actually a neutral word. It just depends on context, whether it's good or bad. Usually it's in Scripture, it's bad. And here it is as well. Satan can bait the hook. Satan can lure the trap. It may be in the form of a person. It may be in the form of a thing. It may be in the form of money. But understand, he has no power, no ability to make you take it. If it was that easy, fishing would be fun, right? If you had control when you make the fish take the bait, that's called catching. That's when it's fun. Fishing ain't, catching is. James says, look, that draw comes from within us. And so whose fault is it? It's us. He says that he is enticed by his own lust. Here, James uses the little word upo, okay? And upo speaks of direct agency. Who's to blame? We all have our particular things that pull and draw us, don't we? Things that lure us to the bait. And what may draw you may not be the same thing that draws me. There's some things that I look at people, I'm like, man, I don't understand that. That makes no sense to me. There's zero draw on my part. But I've got other issues that they may not understand, okay? The upward path of trials is demanding. It requires a response of joy and endurance that results in greater maturity. The downward path is easy. You just give in to your desires. You just surrender to your lust. But James says, look, there's no upside. And so he says, utilize the process of sin. Verse 15 and 16. When lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Here, James now transitions from hunting and fishing imagery to childbirth imagery. And he pictures lust or desire as this woman who conceives and she brings forth a child. And James reminds us that the child always has the same name and that the child always possesses the same personality, okay? Most of us think of sin as a solitary act. What James says is that sin is actually the result of a clear and consistent process. And I wish we had time to go into the Apostle Peter. In his fall in the garden, Peter makes several decisions that seem innocent at the time, ultimately make it to where his fall is almost inevitable. He makes a lot of boneheaded decisions that if by themselves would be fine. But when you start stacking them on top of each other, I mean, he's his own worst enemy. And he ends up denying the Lord. There's a very clear process. It starts with a feeling, a desire that demands to be satisfied, an item that we want to possess, a pleasure that we want to enjoy. And that desire is combined with lies. Don't be deceived, he says. Lies that justify the act. You know, those women in porn, they really do care about you. no one will ever know. The grass is greener on the other side. The one I just love to hear. Don't I deserve to be happy? I have a right to this. One drink, one hit won't hurt. I've got a family member. His addiction to crack cocaine started with went to one party, had cocaine, boom, hooked from that point on in his life. Been in and out of jail numerous times. When desire and deception get together, James says they conceive a child. And that child is not initially visible. Okay? It exists in the will, and if it is allowed to develop, he says it will give birth to the same exact thing for everyone, sin, and when it's born, it's always a murderer. We understand that from a physical standpoint, you cannot have a child unless you have the components of a man and a woman, right? We understand that, and when they're brought together. James said the same thing's true of sin. The person who is able to control their desires and or refuses to be deceived by the lies of the world and of Satan, that's the person who's going to be victorious over temptation. You don't deal with temptation at the behavioral level. You deal with it at the desire level, at the knowledge level, the knowledge of truth level. And so we need to deal with it that we're constantly exchanging those bad things inside of us for the good things. We're taking the bad things out and we're replacing it with good. We refuse to expose ourselves to the things that we know good and well we are susceptible to. You know what you're susceptible to. You don't need anybody to point that out to you. Things that could draw your heart away. And you deal with the deception by filling your mind with the truth of God. Isn't that exactly what Jesus did in the wilderness? He was hungry, but he didn't have any desire for food because he desired something more. He didn't have any desire to have the people wowed when he jumps off the pinnacle of the temple. He doesn't have any desire to, those kings I'm eventually going to get. And you remember, in all of three of those instances, what did he do? How did he respond? It's written. That's amazing, isn't it? He didn't do anything that you and I can't do. If in the midst of our temptation, we are filling our mind with, here's why this would be wrong. Here's a passage, here's a passage, here's a passage. I just don't think we can commit a sin when we're quoting Scripture in our head. Do you? Maybe we can. Maybe there's somebody that's that cold that can do that. I can't do that. I don't foresee myself doing that. James says, don't allow yourself to be tricked. Know where the real problem lies. It's not God allowing you in a trial. It's not God allowing a temptation to come. It's not Satan. It's not other people. He says it's you. Accept responsibility for yourself. There's a lot of that going on these days, isn't there? If you believe like you should, then why do you behave like you shouldn't? If our faith is real, gentlemen, it's going to manifest itself in how we deal with trials, and they can be frustrating, I know, but to deal with them in the right way, to see where they can take us, and to deal with the inevitable temptations that come our way, so that we don't fall to them, we stand against them. Thank you all so much for the way you listen.